Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 20, The Bombardment of Scarborough and Hartlepool, December 16, 1914. All comes out even at the end of the day, and all comes out still more even when all the days are over. Quote by Voltaire. Our intelligence service has won and deserved worldwide fame. More than perhaps any other power, we were successful in the war in penetrating the intentions of the enemy. Again and again, the forecasts both of the military and of the naval intelligence staffs were vindicated to the wonder of friends and the chagrin of foes. The three successive chiefs of the Naval Intelligence Division, Captain Thomas Jackson, Rear Admiral Oliver, and lastly Captain Reginald Hall, were all men of mark in the service, and continuously built and extended an efficient and profound organization. There were others, a brilliant confederacy, whose names even now are better wrapped in mystery. Our information about German naval movements was principally obtained 1. From the reports of secret agents in neutral and enemy countries, and particularly in Germany. 2. From the reports of our submarines, which lay far up in the Heligoland Bight in perilous vigilance. And 3. From a special study we had made of the German wireless. In this we were for a time aided by great good luck. At the beginning of September 1914, the German light cruiser Magdeburg was wrecked in the Baltic. The body of a drowned German under-officer was picked up by the Russians a few hours later, and clasped in his bosom by arms rigid in death were the cipher and signal books of the German Navy and the minutely squared maps of the North Sea and Heligoland Bight. On September 6, the Russian naval attaché came to see me. He had received a message from Petrograd telling him what had happened, and that the Russian Admiralty, with the aid of the cipher and signal books, had been able to decode portions, at least, of the German naval messages. The Russians felt that as the leading naval power, the British Admiralty ought to have these books and charts. If we would send a vessel to Alexandrov, the Russian officers in charge of the books would bring them to England. We lost no time in sending a ship, and late on an October afternoon, Prince Louis and I received from the hands of our loyal allies these sea-stained priceless documents. We set on foot at once an organization for the study of the German wireless and for the translating of the messages when taken in. At the head of the organization was placed Sir Alfred Ewing, the Director of Naval Education, whose services to the Admiralty in this and other matters were of the first order. The work was of great complexity, as of course the cipher is only one element in the means of preserving the secrecy of a message. But gradually, during the beginning of November, our officers succeeded in translating intelligible portions of various German naval messages. They were mostly of a routine character. One of our torpedo boats will be running out into square 7T at 8 p.m., etc. But a careful collection of these scraps provided a body of information from which the enemy's arrangements in the Heligoland Bight could be understood with a fair degree of accuracy. The Germans, however, repeatedly changed their codes and keys, and it was only occasionally and for fitful periods that we were able to penetrate them. As the war went on, they became increasingly suspicious and devised measures which were completely baffling. While, however, this source of information lasted, it was obviously of the very greatest value. The German official history shows itself at last well informed upon this subject. Germany's High Sea Fleet by Reinhard Scheer, page 194. Even if doubt were to exist that the British Admiralty were in possession of the whole secret ciphering system of the German fleet, it has been cleared away by the reliable news from Petrograd that after the stranding of the Magdeburg of Odensholm, the secret papers of that ship, which had been thrown overboard, were picked up by the Russians and communicated to their allies. Lastly, largely through the foresight of Admiral Oliver, we had begun setting up directional stations in August 1914. We thus carried to an unrivaled and indeed unapproached degree of perfection our means of fixing the position and, by successive positions, the course of any enemy ship that used its wireless installation. The English, says Scher in the book Germany's High Sea Fleet, page 73, received news through their directional stations which they already had in use, but which were only introduced by us at a much later period. In possessing them, the English had a very great advantage in the conduct of the war, as they were thus able to obtain quite accurate information of the locality of the enemy as soon as any wireless signals were sent by him. In the case of a large fleet, whose separate units are stationed far apart and communication between them is essential, an absolute cessation of all wireless intercourse would be fatal to any enterprise. But between collecting and weighing information and drawing the true moral therefrom, there is very often an unbridged gap. Signals have been made, the wireless note of a particular ship is heard. Lights are to be shown on certain channels at certain hours. Ships are in movement. Sweeping vessels are active. Channels are buoyed. Lock gates are opened. What does it all mean? At first sight, it all appears to be only ordinary routine. Yet taking the items together may lead to a tremendous revelation. Suffice it to say that all these indications, from whatever sources they emanated, were the subject of a special study by Sir Arthur Wilson, and he had the solemn duty of advising our war group upon them. The silence of the North Sea remained unbroken until the afternoon of Monday, December 14. At about 7 o'clock, Sir Arthur Wilson came to my room and asked for an immediate meeting with the First Sea Lord and the Chief of Staff. It took only a few minutes to gather them. He then explained that his examination of the available intelligence about the enemy indicated the probability of an impending movement which would involve their battle cruisers and perhaps, though of this there was no positive evidence, have an offensive character against our coasts. The German High Sea Fleet, he stated definitely, appeared not to be involved. The indications were obscure and uncertain. There were gaps in the argument. But the conclusion reached after hearing Sir Arthur Wilson was that we should act as if we knew that our assumptions and suppositions were true. It was decided not to move the whole Grand Fleet. A great deal of cruising had been imposed on the fleet owing to the unprotected state of Scarborough, and it was desirable to save wear and tear of machinery and condensers as much as possible. Moreover, the risks of accident, submarine and mine, which were incurred every time that immense organization was sent to sea, imposed a certain deterrent upon its use except when clearly necessary. This decision, from which the Commander-in-Chief did not dissent, was, in the light of subsequent events, much to be regretted. But it must be remembered that the information of which the Admiralty was acting had never yet been tested, that it seemed highly speculative in character, and that for whatever it was worth, it excluded the presence at sea of the German High Sea Fleet. Orders were therefore given immediately for the battle cruisers and the 2nd Battle Squadron, with a light cruiser squadron and a flotilla of destroyers, to raise steam and to proceed to sea at such hours and at such speeds as to enable them to be in an intercepting position at daylight the next morning. Orders were sent to Commodore Tyrwhitt's Harwich force to be at sea off Yarmouth, and to Commodore Keyes to place our 8 available overseas submarines in a position of Terschelling to guard against a southward raid. The coastal forces were also put upon the alert. Admiralty to Commander-in-Chief, December 14, 1914, sent 9:30 p.m. Good information just received shows German 1st Cruiser Squadron with destroyers leave Jade River on Tuesday morning early and return on Wednesday night. It is apparent from the information that the battleships are very unlikely to come out. The enemy force will have time to reach our coast. Send at once, leaving tonight, the Battle Cruiser Squadron and Light Cruiser Squadron, supported by a battle squadron, preferably the 2nd. At daylight on Wednesday morning they should be at some point where they can make sure of intercepting the enemy on his return. Tyrwhitt, with his light cruisers and destroyers, will try to get in touch with enemy off British coast and shadow him, keeping Admiral informed. From our information, the German 1st Cruiser Squadron consists of 4 battle cruisers and 5 light cruisers, and there will possibly be 3 flotillas of destroyers. Acknowledge. Admiralty to Commodore T. Harwich, December 15, 1914, sent 2:05 p.m. There is good probability of German battle cruisers, cruisers and destroyers being off our coast tomorrow about daybreak. 1 M-class destroyer is to patrol vicinity of North Hinder lightship from midnight until 9 a.m. A 2nd M-class destroyer is to patrol a line extending 15 miles south magnetic from a position latitude 53 degrees 0 minutes north, longitude 3 degrees 5 minutes east, from midnight until 9 a.m. The duty of these destroyers is to look out for and report the enemy and trust to their speed to escape. If the weather is too bad, they are to return to Harwich, report their names. The 1st and 3rd flotillas with all available light cruisers are to be under way off Yarmouth before daylight tomorrow, ready to move to any place where the enemy may be reported from, whether it is to the northward or southward. Their duty is to get touch with the enemy, follow him and report his position to the Vice Admiral 2nd Battle Squadron and Vice Admiral 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron. The 2nd Battle Squadron, 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron, 3rd Cruiser Squadron and Light Cruiser Squadron will be in a position in northern latitude 54 degrees 10 minutes, east longitude 3 degrees 0 minutes at 7:30 a.m., ready to cut off retreat of enemy. Should an engagement result, your flotillas and light cruisers must endeavor to join our fleet and deal with enemy destroyers. If the weather is too bad for destroyers, use light cruisers only and send destroyers back. Acknowledge. All measures having been taken on the chance of their being necessary, we awaited during 36 hours the events of Wednesday morning with a doubting but expectant curiosity. On the morning of December 16, at about 8:30, I was in my bath, when the door opened and an officer came hurrying in from the war room with a naval signal, which I grasped with dripping hand. German battlecruisers bombarding Hartlepool. I jumped out of the bath with exclamations. Sympathy for Hartlepool was mingled with what Mr. George Wyndham once called the anodyne of contemplated retaliation. Pulling on clothes over a damp body, I ran downstairs to the war room. The first Sea Lord had just arrived from his house next door. Oliver, who invariably slept in the war room and hardly ever left it by day, was marking the positions on the map. Telegrams from all the naval stations along the coast affected by the attack and intercepts from our ships in the vicinity speaking to each other came pouring in, 2 and 3 to the minute. The Admiralty also spread the tidings and kept the fleets and flotillas continuously informed of all we knew. Everything was now set to sea or set in motion. The 3rd Battle Squadron, the King Edward's, from the 4th, was ordered to prevent the enemy escaping to the northward. As a further precaution, though unless the Germans were driven far to the north, this could hardly be effective in time, the Grand Fleet itself was after all brought out. Commodore Tyrwhitt and his cruisers and destroyers of the Harwich striking force were directed to join Sir George Warrender, who commanded the 2nd Battle Squadron and was the senior admiral with the intercepting force. The weather was, however, too rough for the destroyers, and only the light cruisers could proceed. Lastly, later in the day, Commodore Keyes, who was in the Lurcher, one of our latest destroyers, and had also with him the destroyer Firedrake, was told to take his submarines from his preliminary station off Terschelling into the Heligoland Bight and try to catch the enemy returning. The bombardment of open towns was still new to us at that time, but after all, what did that matter now? The war map showed the German battlecruisers identified one by one within gunshot of the Yorkshire coast, while 150 miles to the eastward, between them and Germany, cutting mathematically their line of retreat, steamed in the exact positions intended 4 British battlecruisers and 6 of the most powerful battleships in the world, forming the 2nd Battle Squadron. Attended and preceded by their cruiser squadrons and flotilla, this fleet of our newest and fastest ships, all armed with the heaviest guns then afloat, could in fair weather cover and watch effectively a front of nearly 100 miles. In the positions in which dawn revealed the antagonists, only one thing could enable the Germans to escape annihilation at the hands of an overwhelming superior force. And while the great shells crashed into the little houses of Hartlepool and Scarborough, carrying their cruel message of pain and destruction to unsuspecting English homes, only one anxiety dominated the thoughts of the Admiralty war room. The word visibility assumed a sinister significance. At present it was quite good enough. Both Warrender and Beatty had horizons of nearly 10 miles. Near the coast, fighting was actually in progress at 7,000 yards. There was nothing untoward in the weather indications. At 9 a.m. the German bombardment ceased, and their ships were soon out of sight of land, no doubt on their homeward voyage. We went on tenterhooks to breakfast. To have this tremendous prize, the German battlecruiser squadron, whose loss would fatally mutilate the whole German navy and could never be repaired, actually within our claws, and to have the event all turn upon a veil of mist, was a racking ordeal. Meanwhile, telegraph and telephone were pouring the distress of Hartlepool and Scarborough to all parts of the kingdom, and by 10:30, when the War Committee of the Cabinet met, news magnified by rumour had produced excitement. I was immediately asked how such a thing was possible. What was the Navy doing, and what were they going to do? In reply, I produced the chart which showed the respective positions at the moment of the British and German naval forces, and I explained that subject to moderate visibility, we hoped that collision would take place about noon. These disclosures fell upon all with a sense of awe, and the committee adjourned till the afternoon. At 10:30 the Admiralty learned that the enemy was leaving our coasts and apprised Admiral Warrender accordingly. Enemy is probably returning towards Heligoland. You should keep outside minefield and steer so as to cut him off." But now already ominous telegrams began to arrive. Warrender soon had horizons of only 7,000 yards, Beatty of only 6,000. Some of the light cruisers nearer to the coast already mentioned 5,000, and later on 4,000 was signalled. Meanwhile, no contact. Noon passed, and then 1 o'clock. The weather got steadily worse. It was evident that the mist curtains were falling over the North Sea. 3,000 yards visibility, 2,000 yards visibility were reported by ships speaking to each other. The solemn faces of Fisher and Wilson betrayed no emotion, but one felt the fire burning within. I tried to do other work, but it was not much good. Obscure messages were heard from our fleet. Evidently they were very close to the enemy, groping for him in a mist which allowed vessels to be distinguished only within 2,000 yards. We heard Warrender order his priceless ships to steam through the located German minefield off the Yorkshire coast, apparently in an endeavour to close with something just out of sight, just beyond his fingertips. Then all of a sudden we hear Rear Admiral Goodenough, with the light cruisers, report that he had opened fire upon a German light cruiser at 3,000 yards. Hope flared up. Once contact was established, would it not drag all other events in its train? The prospect of a confused battle at close range had no terrors for the Admiralty. They had only one fear, lest the enemy should escape. Even the proposed movement of the 2nd Battle Squadron through the minefield was received in utter silence. About 1:30 Sir Arthur Wilson said, "They seem to be getting away from us." But now occurred a new development of a formidable kind. At 1:50 we learned that the High Sea Fleet was at sea. Up till noon this great fleet had not spoken. Once she had spoken and the necessary calculations had been made, which took some time, we could both recognize and locate her. She had already, in fact, advanced far into the North Sea. The apparition of the German fleet, which, as we then supposed, was advancing to the support of the German battle cruisers, entirely altered the balance of strength. Our 10 great ships steaming together with their light squadrons and flotillas were not only the strongest but the fastest naval force in the world. No equal German force existed, which could at once overtake and overcome them. On the other hand, they were not capable of meeting the High Sea Fleet. The German battlecruisers were still separated from their fleet by 150 miles, but it seemed to us that a running action begun with the German battlecruisers might, in the thick weather then prevailing, conceivably lead to a surprise encounter with the main naval power of the enemy. This was certainly not the wish of the Admiralty. We instantly warned our squadrons. Admiralty to 2nd Battle Squadron and 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron. Sent 1:50 p.m. Urgent. High Sea Fleet is out and was in latitude 54 degrees 38 minutes north, longitude 5 degrees 55 minutes east at 0:30 p.m. today, so do not go too far to eastward. Footnote: the position is about 80 miles west of Heligoland. End of footnote. These sinister possibilities soon faded like our earlier hopes. The High Sea Fleet was not, as we imagined, coming out, but had long been out and was now retiring. At 3 o'clock I went over and told the War Committee what was passing, but with what a heavy heart did I cross again that Horse Guards parade. I returned to the Admiralty. The war group had reassembled around the octagonal table in my room. The shades of a winter's evening had already fallen. Sir Arthur Wilson then said, in his most ordinary manner, "Well, there you are. They have got away. They must be about here by now." And he pointed to the chart on which the chief of the staff was marking the positions every 15 minutes. It was evident that the Germans had eluded our intercepting force, and that even their light cruisers, with whom we had been in contact, had also escaped in the mist. Sir Admiral Warrender, in his subsequent report, "They came out of the rainstorm and disappeared in another." It was now nearly 8 o'clock. Was it then all over? I inquired about our submarines. They had already been collected by Commodore Keyes from their first position and were now moving on to the German line of retreat. But whether the enemy's course would come within their limited range was a matter of luck. Sir Arthur Wilson then said, "There is only one chance now. Keyes, with the Lurcher and Fire Drake, is with the submarines. He could probably make certain of attacking the German battlecruiser squadron as it enters the Bight tonight. He may torpedo one or even two." It seemed indeed a forlorn hope to send these two frail destroyers, with their brave commodore and faithful crews, far from home, close to the enemy's coast, utterly unsupported, into the jaws of this powerful German force with its protecting vessels and flotillas. There was a long silence. We all knew Keyes well. Then someone said, "It is sending him to his death." Someone else said, "He would be the last man to wish us to consider that." There was another long pause. However, Sir Arthur Wilson had already written the following message. 8:12 p.m. "We think Heligoland and Amrum lights will be lit when ships are going in. Your destroyers might get a chance to attack about 2 a.m. or later on the line given you." The First Sea Lord nodded assent. The chief of the staff took it, got up heavily, and quitted the room. Then we turned to the ordinary business of the day and also to the decision of what could be told to the public about the event. 2 days later, when I received Admiral Keyes in my room at the Admiralty, I said, "We sent you a terrible message the other night. I hardly expected to see you again." "It was terrible," he said, "not getting it till I was nearly home. I waited 3 hours in the hopes of such an order, and I very nearly did it on my own responsibility." And he proceeded to reproach himself without need. Footnote: It must be explained that in these days the wireless communication with destroyers, and still more submarines, was not as perfect as it became later on. The Fire Drake had therefore been stationed in the morning midway between the submarines and Harwich to pass on messages. She had late in the afternoon, after the orders to take the submarines into the Bight had reached her, rejoined Commodore Keyes, and the link was for the time being broken. End of footnote. So far I have described this episode of December 16 exactly as it appeared from the war room of the Admiralty, and as we understood it at the time. But let us now see in essentials what had happened. Footnote: The whole of this operation is described in minute detail in the official British naval history, and should be studied with the excellent charts by those who are interested in its technical aspect. So complicated is the full story that the lay reader cannot see the wood for the trees. I have endeavored to render intelligible the broad effects. End of footnote. No one could tell at what point on our shores the German attack would fall, and with 500 miles of coast studded with possible objectives to guard, there could be no certain solution. The orders issued by the Commander-in-Chief, however, and the dawn position selected, ably comprehended the design of the enemy. In pursuance of these orders, the 2nd Battle Squadron, 6 ships, and the battle cruiser squadron, 4 ships, together with the 3rd cruiser squadron, a squadron of light cruisers and a flotilla steaming down from Scarborough, Cromarty, and the 4th, arrived at about 5:30 in the morning of the 16th, 2 hours and a half before daybreak, at the southern edge of the Dogger Bank. Here, in the very center of the North Sea, almost on a line drawn from Hartlepool to Heligoland, the advanced screen of British destroyers became engaged with German destroyers and light cruisers, and when daylight came, they sighted a large German cruiser identified as the Rune. Fighting ensued. Some of our destroyers were hit, and the Germans retreated to the eastward. Thereupon Admiral Beatty with his battle cruisers began to chase the Rune. From this pursuit he was recalled by the news which reached him and Admiral Warrender from the Admiralty about 9 a.m., that the German battle cruisers were bombarding Hartlepool and later Scarborough. All the British ships at once turned to the westward and steamed abreast in a long line towards the British coast and the German battle cruisers, whose interception appeared highly probable. During the war, we were puzzled to understand what the Rune and the German light forces were doing on the edge of the Dogger Bank at this hour in the morning. It was an ill-assorted force to be in so exposed a position, and it was not a force or in a position which could be of any help to the German cruisers raiding the British coasts. Now we know the answer. The Rune and her cruisers and destroyers were part of the advanced screen of the German High Sea Fleet, who were out in full force, 3 squadrons strong, with all their attendant vessels and numerous flotillas. Admiral von Ingenohl, in command of the High Sea Fleet, had sailed from Cuxhaven after darkness had fallen on the evening of the 15th, between 4 and 5 p.m., and before dawn of the 16th was pushing boldly out towards the Dogger Bank in support of his battle cruisers, who, under Admiral von Hipper, were already approaching the British shores. Had von Ingenohl continued on his course, as was his intention, his scouts would between 8 and 9 o'clock in the clear weather of that morning in this part of the North Sea have come in sight of the British battle cruisers and the 2nd Battle Squadron coming down from the north. A meeting was almost certain. What would have happened? Admiral von Tirpitz proclaims that this was the one heaven-sent, never-recurring opportunity for a battle with the odds enormously in German favor. On December 16, he wrote a few weeks later, Ingenohl had the fate of Germany in the palm of his hand. I boil with inward emotion whenever I think of it. We will examine this claim later. Let us first follow the event. Admiral von Ingenohl had already strained his instructions by going so far to sea. An appeal by him against the muzzling order which the Emperor had issued after the action of the Heligoland Bight of August 28 had recently encountered a rebuff. The fleet must be held back and avoid actions which might lead to heavy losses. Such had been the latest ukase. And here was the fleet right out in the middle of the North Sea in the darkness of a December dawn. Suddenly, the flashes of guns, English destroyers reported in action with the cruisers of his screen, the screen retiring, the destroyers pursuing, and still 2 hours before daylight. Von Ingenohl conceived himself in danger of a torpedo attack in darkness. At about 5:30, therefore, he turned his whole fleet about and steamed off southeastward. And shortly after 6 o'clock, increasingly disquieted by his hampering instructions, but knowing no more of the presence of our squadrons than they of him, he, in the justly chosen words of the British official historian, fairly turned tail and made for home, leaving his raiding force in the air. Even so, at 6 o'clock the two fleets were only about 50 miles apart, and their light forces in contact. Says Scheer, who was in command of the German 2nd Squadron, in Germany's High Sea Fleet, page 71, "Our premature turning on to an east-southeast course had robbed us of the opportunity of meeting certain divisions of the enemy according to the prearranged plan, which is now seen to have been correct." There was, however, no compulsion upon Admirals Warrender and Beatty to fight such an action. Their squadrons were moving properly protected by their screen of cruisers and destroyers. In this part of the sea and at this hour the weather was quite clear. They would have known what forces they were in presence of before they could become seriously engaged. There would not have been any justification for trying to fight the high sea fleet of 20 battleships, with 6 battleships and 4 battle cruisers, even though these comprised our most powerful vessels. Nor was there any need. The British 2nd Battle Squadron could steam in company at 20 knots, or could escape with forced draught at 21, and only 6 of von Ingenholz's ships could equal that speed. As for the battle cruisers, nothing could catch them. The safety of this force acting detached from the main British fleet was inherent in its speed. Admirals Warrender and Beatty could therefore have refused battle with the German fleet, and it would certainly have been their duty to do so. Still, having regard to the large numbers of destroyers at sea with the German fleet and the chances of darkness and weather, the situation at this juncture, as we now know it to have been, gives cause for profound reflection. That it never materialized unfavorably was the reward of previous audacity. The 16th of December lay under the safeguard of the 28th of August. We now enter upon the second phase of this extraordinary day. All 4 British squadrons, with their flotilla between 9 and 10 o'clock, were steaming towards the British coasts. The German raiding cruisers, having finished their bombardments, were now seeking to return home with the utmost speed. There were 2 large minefields which had been laid earlier in the war by the Germans off the Yorkshire coast, and we, having located them and considering them as a protection against raiding, had improved them by laying additional mines. Between these minefields there was opposite Whitby and Scarborough a gap about 15 miles wide. Sir John Jellicoe, reflecting upon the whole position from the Iron Duke from afar, formed the opinion that the enemy would either try to escape to the northward by steaming up our coast inside the minefield, or, much more probably, would come straight out eastward through the gap opposite Whitby and Scarborough. He had ordered the 3rd Battle Squadron from the 4th to close the gap to the northward, and this was rapidly being effected. At 10:10 he signalled to Sir George Warrender, telling him the position of the gap in the minefield opposite Whitby, and adding, "Enemy will in all probability come out there." Admirals Warrender and Beatty were already proceeding on this assumption, which, in fact, correctly divined what the Germans were doing. At 11 o'clock, therefore, the 4 German battle cruisers, with their light cruisers returning independently 60 miles ahead of them, were steaming due east for Heligoland at their highest speed. At the same time, all our 4 squadrons were steaming due west in a broad sweep directly towards them. The distance between the fleets was about 100 miles, and they were approaching each other at an aggregate speed of over 40 miles an hour. Across the course of our fleet lay the southwest patch of the Dogger Bank, on which there was not enough water for battle cruisers, either British or German. The British sweeping line therefore divided, Beatty and the light cruisers going north of the patch, Warrender with the battleships and the 3rd Cruiser Squadron going south of it. This involved a certain detour and delay in our advance. The weather, moreover, became very bad. The mist descended and the sea ran high. The German light cruisers were now sighted by our light cruiser squadron scouting ahead of Beatty through the driving mist and rainstorms. The Southampton, the most southerly light cruiser, opened fire and was answered by the enemy. Hopes on board the Lion rose. Just at the place and just at the moment when they might expect it was the enemy's cruiser screen. Clearly the main body was behind them. Probably it was not far behind. But now mischance intervened. The other 3 British light cruisers, seeing the Southampton engaged to the southward, turned in that direction to join in the fight, and the Birmingham opened fire. This was not in accordance with the wishes of Admiral Beatty, who wished to keep his scouts in front of him at the time when he must expect to be closely approaching the enemy's battle cruisers, and when the danger of missing them was so great. He therefore ordered his light cruisers to return to their stations. The signal, instead of being directed by name to the 2 vessels, who were not engaged, was made general to the light cruiser squadron, and acting on this order, the Southampton and Birmingham both broke off their action with the German cruiser and resumed their places in the line. The German light cruisers turned off to the southward and vanished in the mist. Contact with them was thus lost. Meanwhile, however, the battle cruisers on both sides continued rapidly to approach each other. At 12:15, Admiral von Hipper, warned by his light cruisers that the enemy force was immediately in front of him, also turned slightly and to the southeast. Admiral Beatty continued on his course till 12:30. At this moment the 2 battle cruiser forces were only 25 miles apart and still rapidly closing. But now again mischance. The German light cruisers, deflected away to the southward from Beatty, came into contact with the 3rd cruiser squadron in front of Warrender. Fire again was opened and returned, and again the enemy cruisers were lost in the thick mist. They reported to von Hipper that on this path also was a blocking force. Thereupon, at 12:45, he made a 3/4 left-about turn, if I may employ a cavalry term, and dodged off due north. This by itself would not have saved him. Had Admiral Beatty held on his original course for another quarter of an hour, an action at decisive ranges must have begun before 1 o'clock. But observe what had happened. At 12:30, Admiral Beatty had received a signal from Sir George Warrender at the moment of the second contact with the German light cruisers. Enemy cruisers and destroyers in sight. He therefore concluded that the German battle cruisers had slipped past him to the southward, and acting in addition on the sound principle of keeping between the enemy and the enemy's home at all costs, he too whipped round and steamed back on his course, that is, eastward, for 3/4 of an hour. At 1:15, hearing that the enemy battle cruisers had turned north, he too turned north. But contact was never re-established. Von Hipper succeeded in escaping round the northern flank of our squadrons. His light cruisers, so thick was the weather, made their way through the 3rd cruiser squadron, passing for a few moments actually in sight of Warrender's battleships. Thus ended this heart-shaking game of blind man's buff. It remains only to mention the action of our British submarines. By 3:30, Commodore Keyes had collected 4 of his boats from their station submerged off Terschelling, and in accordance with Admiralty orders was making for the Heligoland Bight. Eventually he succeeded in placing 3 boats on the southern side of Heligoland and 1 on the northern. This solitary boat, under Commander Nesmith, on the morning of the 17th, found itself in the middle of von Hipper's squadron and flotillas returning from their raid, and fired 2 torpedoes at battle cruisers under very difficult conditions without effect. Such was the episode of the Scarborough and Hartlepool raids. All that we could tell the public was contained in the following communiqué, which was issued in the morning papers of December 17. Admiralty, December 16, 9:20 p.m. This morning a German cruiser force made a demonstration upon the Yorkshire coast, in the course of which they shelled Hartlepool, Whitby, and Scarborough. A number of their fastest ships were employed for this purpose, and they remained about an hour on the coast. They were engaged by the patrol vessels on the spot. As soon as the presence of the enemy was reported, a British patrolling squadron endeavored to cut them off. On being sighted by British vessels, the Germans retired at full speed, and, favored by the mist, succeeded in making good their escape. The losses on both sides are small, but full reports have not yet been received. The Admiralty take the opportunity of pointing out that demonstrations of this character against unfortified towns or commercial ports, though not difficult to accomplish, provided that a certain amount of risk is accepted, are devoid of military significance. They may cause some loss of life among the civilian population and some damage to private property, which is much to be regretted. But they must not, in any circumstances, be allowed to modify the general naval policy which is being pursued. Naturally, there was much indignation at the failure of the Navy to prevent, or at least to avenge, such an attack upon our shores. What was the Admiralty doing? Were they all asleep? Although the bombarded towns, in which nearly 500 civilians had been killed and wounded, supported their ordeal with fortitude, dissatisfaction was widespread. However, we could not say a word in explanation. We had to bear in silence the censures of our countrymen. We could never admit, for fear of compromising our secret information, where our squadrons were or how near the German raiding cruisers had been to their destruction. One comfort we had. The indications upon which we had acted had been confirmed by events. The sources of information upon which we relied were evidently trustworthy. Next time we might at least have average visibility. But would there be a next time? The German admiral must have known that he was very near to powerful British ships, but which they were, or where they were, or how near he was, might be a mystery. Would it not also be a mystery how they came to be there? On the other hand, the exultation of Germany at the hated English towns being actually made to feel for the first time the real lash of war might encourage a second attempt. Even the indignation of our own newspapers had a value for this purpose. One could only hope for the best. Meanwhile, British naval plans and secrets remained wrapped in impenetrable silence.